code everything correctly. Also, it's often a billing requirement that you code things accurately and correctly as well. However, according to the DME Max, correct coding guideline announcements and correct coding is important because the use of appropriate HCPCS codes assures that accurate processing can be accomplished, resulting in a proper claim determination and reimbursement. In other words, a correctly coded claim is going to be a clean claim, and that clean claim is going to be a paid claim. Just kind of for a little example here, the recent CGS 2023 Q1 report for knee orthosis prepayment reviews showed about a 38% error rate because the code on the claim was not the correct code for the item billed. This was the second highest error rate for those KOs. Now that's a lot of claims denied needing to be appealed or fixed just because of something as simple as incorrect coding. So correct coding can really influence your bottom line as well. Now on to the when is an item considered to be coded correctly. Once again, this is going to be related to Medicare. However, as I said before, the concepts are sound and could apply to other payers as well. And the answer for this question is going to come from the Medicare Program Integrity Manual. And that kind of states that an item is correctly coded when it meets all of the coding guidelines listed in CMS HCPCS guidelines, the local coverage determination or LCDs, the LCD related policy articles, or the DME MAC articles. This would also include things such as a PDAC requirement and correct coding reminders that are jointly published by the DME MACs and PDACs, and we'll kind of get into those a little bit more here as we go along. And these are all the elements we're going to examine, as I said, plus some more in the next couple slides. So if you can show and explain that you followed and used all these guidelines and tips, then you can show that you are compliant and correctly coding an item. So last up is the who, or who is responsible for providing and reporting properly coded items. And that responsibility comes down to you as that supplier and biller of record. So it's not up to the manufacturer recommendations or the distributor's suggestions or the sales reps or even us here at AOPA. The final determination is up to you, and you may use us at AOPA or manufacturers and sales reps and everything to help you for their guidance, but it's going to be up to you to use your best judgment to determine proper coding. So you do have some leeway in that it is your judgment, but following all of these established guidelines and protocols and tips puts yourself in a better and more defensible place than if you're just guessing. And that ability to kind of use your best judgment in some cases will also allow you to use those miscellaneous codes or those 99 codes when needed or when they are appropriate. Last up, and the main point of review for this presentation, how do you ensure you select and use the correct code or codes? Per Medicare guidelines, as I briefly mentioned before, there are 4 key things you can review and examine to ensure that you are selecting the correct code or codes when describing the items you are providing and submitting a claim for. Now, these are going to be in no particular or special order. You may only need to use one of them to determine that you coded something correctly, or you may need to use a combination of them, or you may end up using all 4 just to do a thorough double check. First are the local coverage determination and policy articles, or in other words, what Medicare covers and how they cover it. Number 2 are going to be the supplemental DME MAC correct coding announcements or billing reminder bulletins. Now, these are going to be things that are published and released, sporadically throughout the year, and then, they get routinely updated and revised to kind of give you current and up-to-date information and guidelines and tips. The third tip or tool is the use of the PDAC verification system, or the product classification list on the PDAC website. And then lastly is the use of the full and complete HCPCS code descriptor, not just the short version of it, but the long, full fledged descriptor. We're going to go ahead and look at the last tip first, and that is to review and look at the full and complete HCPCS code, and not just that condensed version that you might be used to using. You'll want to examine and look at the descriptor in a whole and dissect all of its parts, or looking at each word and punctuation mark in that descriptor for guidance. The reason you kind of look at it and use it is because the long descriptor often provides more detail regarding the requirements for the code, and that most code narratives are going to be written broadly and kind of be, a little bit more inclusive. So you kind of get a lot more detail into how things might function and what codes would be appropriate for you. Now, you may not find a specific code that perfectly matches, the product or item or service that you're providing, and that's when you then kind of may choose to use, the code that most closely describes the item or that functional equivalent. And then you can also kind of start thinking about maybe, okay, is this a situation or scenario where that miscellaneous code then becomes that most correct or most appropriate action. So here are going to be some quick examples of how the long descriptors could be used or could help you with your coding. And as I said at the beginning, these aren't the end all be all of examples. They're more to kind of provide you with a little bit of context to help you start thinking about how you can use these tools individually and together as well. So let's kind of look at the L1940, or the all-inclusive AFO plastic material, or otherwise custom fabricated. Now, some key things that pop out is the wording here of other material, right? So this shows and says that you would not be able to use an addition code to describe carbon fiber or similar materials, because the full descriptor here implies that the L1940 may be made with any type of material or anything along those lines. So you wouldn't have that there. This is described in more detail as well when you start looking at the AFO, KFO policy articles as well. And also, if you look at the code descriptor here for the L2755, you can see that here it also makes the indication or the distinction that it can only be used with custom fabricated orthoses only. So you would not be able to use the L2755 when you're using a prefabricated AFO, even if that AFO is going to be custom fitted. The L2755 should only be reserved for your custom fabricated orthoses. So how about the prosthetic ultralight material or the L5940 or the L5950? Here you have keywords endoskeletal, and then you also kind of have the keywords here of below knee. So this is going to show and tell that these addition codes could and should only be used with below knee endoskeletal prosthetic base code items, and that it could not be used, for example, for any upper extremity coding. And as you may know, Medicare has recently started to crack down on proper anatomical and segmental codes. So be aware when that full and long code descriptor includes those markers or properties, because Medicare is looking at that, and you should not be mixing endoskeletal codes with exoskeletal codes, or below knee with above knee, or with upper extremity. Two more quick examples here. The L2006, besides saying it's a double upright KFO, you see how the full descriptor clearly states or defines any type of ankle joint, and that it also includes any material. So this is going to mean that when you are coding for or providing an L 2006, you would not and could not include other materials or any other styles or types of joints, right? So once again, this long full descriptor gives you some of those guidances of what can be and cannot be included within that specific code. Last up is going to be like the Crow Boot code, the L4631, and the mention of its inclusion of soft interface and all other key elements of the Crow Boot, like having a varus valgus adjustment, a pre-tibial shell, and custom arches and the padding and things like that, right? And it also says it includes any type of closure or strapping. So you could not then code on top of a Crow Boot the inclusion of like a BOA or a Revo type ratcheting closing system, because any type of closure is already included within that base code. Now, another good example of using the long descriptors is when you're trying to code out your spinal braces, because as you know, those descriptors include very specific anatomical markers for each code. So they give you a great idea of what code should be used for that particular device when you match it up to what you're actually providing and looking at. So next up are the local coverage determination and the policy articles. Now the LCDs are more for providing you medical necessity information, what is covered and when, but the policy articles can and will provide you with some valuable coding guidelines. These guidelines include providing in-depth code descriptions for select codes beyond what's even going to be found in that long HCPCS descriptor, such as what it is and what it's not, what's included and what's not included for that particular code, even details into how that particular item or feature functions or is intended to function, in other words, what it does and what it does not do. And then in some policy articles, you also have directions of what codes can and cannot be used with certain other codes, or things that would or would not be mutually exclusive. A good example of this is, in the KO policy, where you have the specific charts which show you which addition codes can be used with which base codes. But newer versions of, let's say, like the lower limb prosthetic policy also have several entries on this topic, where they'll lay out, what codes can be used with which base code. So, this information is getting housed within the policy articles more and more. It's becoming a more and more in-depth discussions within those policy articles as to what constitutes the correct coding and what can be used with each information. Now the policy articles will also kind of help you identify and define, what's custom fabricated, what's prefabricated, what is custom fit, and what is off the shelf. It'll also let you know if a particular code or item you have would require that PDAC coding verification or not. So the policy articles provide you with a lot of great tools to kind of help you narrow down your coding decisions, or to give you a little bit more explanation and definition on certain codes. So the first example here, we'll kind of look at, the L5980. So kind of what does the policy article and coding guidelines tell us about the 5980? Kind of states here, it has a J-shaped keel section and a heel attached to it as well. So if you're thinking about using this code, you would have to examine the foot, right, and see if it has a J-shaped design. So it's going to have a J-shaped design, and that it has an independent heel component attached to that J shape. If there is no heel, then you may not want to use the 5980 because it's not meeting these full coding guidelines. And then most importantly, the policy article also states that, you know, all feet described by the 5980 must be reviewed and listed by the PDAC. So how about like a 5984? You know, this is what the policy kind of has to say about it, right? So the 5984 can and should only be used to create a rotational feature at the ankle level, right? So if you're doing or trying to provide some rotation at the knee or that socket level, then you could not and should not be using the 5984. Remember that there's now a new code for that knee level rotation, and that is that K1022. So once again, you know, here within the policy article, they've defined the L5984 to be only at the ankle level. Some other prosthetic policy examples might be kind of, you know, the direction that the ultralight code that we looked at, the 5940 or 5950, may only be used for the socket fabrication and not the componentry, and that the socket must be that definitive or replacement socket, or even that the L5987 code, you know, does not describe the vertical loading or shock absorption achieved from the flexibility of the natural J-shaped keel section, but rather there needs to be a separate vertical pylon that allows for that controlled motion for shock absorption. So these policy articles kind of get very in depth for you. So what about some orthotic policy examples? You can kind of take here like a look at the pretibial shell. So a pretibial shell must be made of plastic or similar type of material so that it is rigid, but most importantly, it must have an overlapping and locking feature. So, you know, a piece of leather or a piece of plastic just added to the AFO or KFO would not be considered the pretibial shell unless it has that overlapping and interlocking feature and it is made of plastic or other type of materials. So how about the crow boot? You know, the policy writes out all the 7 key features or elements that are included in the crow boot by breaking it down, the code descriptor, to kind of say that it has that arch support and all those things. But what I want to focus on is the last piece in the statement here, and that reinforces that you could not code any additional types of closure systems, and more directly that the L4631 is considered to be an all-inclusive code, and that no other codes may be added or used for it, right? You know, so some of this is what we kind of talked about before when reviewing that long descriptor, but here we have a more detailed breakdown of it and reinforces those interpretations of the code descriptor by clearly stating that it has all straps and enclosures and that it is all inclusive and does not include any other additional addition codes possible. So now on to the DME MAC and PDAC in the jointly released coding or correct coding billing reminders. These are typically released, as I said, sporadically or whenever the DME MACs and PDAC have seen some issues with coding and or billing, and they want to educate everyone and update their procedures. These bulletins can be about specific codes, like the one for the tension orthosis, the L1005, or sets of codes like the one for, you know, microprocessor knees or scoliosis braces, or about a particular product like the one for the Arizona AFOs. They can even be much broader and cover a whole specific benefit category, such as the one for upper extremity orthoses, or for like halos, or even the most recently retired upper extremity prosthetic bulletin. These bulletins, when covering a specific benefit category, could create a de facto policy for you to follow. So they can create a policy when there is no other policy or LCD present, or provide an in-depth coding guidance for you. So the purpose of these reminders is to help you and to provide some guidance, for better or worse, on the areas that have been showing some issues. Now, lastly, it's important to stress that once these announcements or bulletins are released, you are expected to know about them and to follow them, just as if the information were in the LCDs or the policy articles themselves. And then in some cases, the information from these bulletins will eventually find their way into the policy articles and LCDs. So here are some quick examples of the correct coding. Like there is one for most upper extremity orthoses, and this kind of gets into talking about how each of these particular devices function and what types of coatings they may be used for it. There's one that's kind of dedicated to articulating digits and prosthetic hands. This article really focuses on what kinds of codes could be used with the L6026 base code. So it gets very specific into one category or one topic. They even provide guidance on how to correctly code for split, off-the-shelf, and custom-fitted items when there are no established off-the-shelf codes, which that is to use that miscellaneous code. There's even a guidance that reminds you that if the code descriptor only includes the phrase fitting and adjustment, but there is no mention of that being off the shelf or custom fitted, that item would be considered custom fitted in nature. There's guidance on the scoliosis coding, that since scoliosis braces are not covered within the TLSO policy, this provides you that additional guidance on coding out like the L1005, the 1300, and the such. And then also, as I kind of alluded to earlier with the who, what, and when introduction, there's even a bulletin talking about what makes up correct coding and goes over some of the items we're talking about here in this presentation. There's also guidance and directives on how to code for toe fillers and diabetic shoe inserts, plus a couple more. You can view these articles or reminders using this link here. Now, the articles are routinely revised and updated, and sometimes even retired, as with that upper extremity prosthetic reminder of late, and can also eventually be folded into current LCDs and policy articles, such as was the case with like the ultralight coding and the PDAC verification reminder for select KOs and spinal braces. So be sure you're kind of looking at these articles on a regular basis and reviewing like the policy article history revisions to see if these have been incorporated or updated. Last up is of the primary tools is to check or to help with your correct coding is the PDAC product verification list, or the listing of all the PDAC recommended codes for specific products and items. The pricing data analysis and coding contractor, or PDAC, is that official coder for Medicare. So what they say goes, other words. Now, not all items require a PDAC verification in order to be considered coded correctly. To determine if the item you're providing requires a PDAC review and verification, double check the policy articles and the special DME MAC PDAC coding bulletins for those updates. Now, it's also possible that an item can be listed on the PDAC product verification list and not required to be there. And if that is the case, you must use those PDAC provided codes. Whether that item is required to be listed and verified or was voluntarily submitted for review, the codes selected by the PDAC are binding. This means that in order to be considered correctly coded, you must use those PDAC approved and verified codes. Now, this slide just provides some links here for you that kind of help. The first link here is to the verification list, so you can check and see if the particular product or model has a PDAC code verification or not. And this should be done prior to your final billing, so you can make any changes if need be. The second link is to a downloadable Excel spreadsheet, which will indicate what codes or items require a PDAC verification as part of proper coding and billing. These are the codes that have been mandated by the PDAC, by CMS and by the PDAC to have approval. You can kind of edit the list just to show just your L codes. And just remember that not every item or code requires PDAC verification. However, once an item has been reviewed and listed by the PDAC, that coding is binding when billing Medicare. Now, these are just some other quick things to consider if you want to go deeper into making sure you're coding items correctly. CMS guidelines are clear that HCPCS codes describe the product and not the price. So fees are not part of correct coding. Selecting a code based upon the fee schedule may result in incorrect coding determination, and also routinely coding items based on fees or adding codes to increase reimbursement will easily lead you down the path to fraudulent billing practices. Also be sure that you're only using one base code per item and that you're not mixing benefit codes, such as using orthotic codes with a prosthetic base code, because you're going to have to make sure that both benefit categories are met, and it can lead to a lot of documentation errors as well. You may also want to consider using like the medically unlikely edits or MUEs, as they inform you how many units you could bill on any given data service. Now, these numbers are not automatic, meaning you don't get the bill for the total amount listed, but rather it would be considered what would be appropriate based off of clinical input. You still must only provide and code for what is medically necessary. Just because something has an MUE of 10 doesn't mean you automatically get to bill those 10 units out. You could also use the PTP, or procedure to procedure edits, as these help you determine what codes could be billed together or what's allowed to be billed together. Now, all these tools here for the MUEs and the PTPs can be found on the National Correct Coding Initiative page of the CMS website. But as a side note here, Medicare and Medicare doesn't use the PTP edits, but Medicaid and other private payers may. So what can you do with all this information? You can kind of create a quick policy or guidelines for your company to ensure that all your practitioners are coding things correctly. That doesn't have to be overly complex, just maybe 3 or 4 simple steps or hints, kind of like L code selection is independent of allowables. Select the most accurate functional equivalent code consistent with HCPCS descriptors, policy, special bulletins, or PDAC guidance. Only using one base code per device or per item. And if no code seems accurate, use a not otherwise specified code with a narrative description. So that ends today's presentation. Thank you for your time, and thank you for participating in this year's Ethics and Compliance Week. And sorry for me being a little long-winded here. It tends to happen. I like to talk a lot. So I will turn it back to Joy here to see if we have any questions, or if not, we'll give you back some time in your day.
That's great. We do have one question, Devin. So if you're an AOPA member, can they reach out to the Coding and Reimbursement Committee to help with any issues they may be experiencing?
Yes, as an AOPA member, you do have access to us here to provide you with that coding guidance. That might be something that Joe or I may be able to handle. And if it gets into things that may need a little bit more clinical insight or more deep thought, we then involve our Coding and Reimbursement Committee to provide us with a little bit more in-depth knowledge. This is open to patient care facilities and practitioners, but it's also an option for manufacturers as well to provide items to us to review.
Great. Thank you, Devin. And thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope to see you tomorrow for the last day of Compliance Week. And again, we are recording all these and we'll be getting the recordings and slides as well as a couple other resources out to you either Friday or early next week. So thanks again and hope everybody has a good rest of their day.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.